Well, welcome. We appreciate everybody joining us today. We have quite a few people signed on live. We also want to thank people for your patience, with this. Both today, we're running a few minutes late today, but also most people know we had to postpone the seminar due to some medical issues. One of our staff here, who is doing quite well, recovering, great, and we are excited to have this, multiple seminar series, going now. And the timing feels even more apropos with what's going on in our world. Today's seminar is The Shadow and the Problem of Evil, seminar number 1. This will be the introduction and some considerations. Dr. Murray Stein will be our presenter today. I will be the host, and Ryan Deegan will be behind the scenes helping us out as well. We have numerous people joining us from many countries, yet again. We are delighted to have people from Australia, Brazil, Colombia, Canada, Denmark, Israel, Mexico, Japan, New Zealand, Portugal, Slovakia, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and of course the United States. This will be a slightly different format. We are going to have the typical 90-minute presentation that we've been doing the last few years. We're also going to add an optional 30-minute discussion afterwards. So please stay after the 90 minutes and ask questions. We may be able to open some webcams or microphones. We can certainly do emailed questions and chatted questions. If there's not much interest in discussions, we can end early, but I suspect there'll be a fair amount of energy to keep going for the 30 minutes afterwards. And you can send us chat questions, through the system, or you can email us any, questions. Make sure that you've clicked on the correct audio choices in the upper left-hand corner. You can use microphone and speakers or telephone. Most will use the microphone and speaker setting, and your microphone is muted, so don't worry about that. Make sure to enter full screen mode and enlarge the presenter and the presentation. There's ways of maximizing and minimizing both the slides and the presenters, so make sure you've optimized that. We are taping today, so any questions that you send, either audio or in writing, could be repeated. Please let us know if you want to remain anonymous in any question that you email or chat to us. The next shadow seminar will be The Criminal Mind and Criminality in Society, featuring Sarah Stein, who, yes, indeed, is a relation to Dr. Murray Stein, and we are highly looking forward to that. Should be an excellent seminar. Murray will be joining us for that one as well, but Sarah Stein will be the main presenter February 18th at 11 a.m. Eastern U.S. time. And then I'd like to introduce Murray Stein to you. Virtually everybody attending probably knows him. He's presented so many times for us over the last number of years. Murray resides in Zurich, Switzerland, or just outside of Zurich, where he teaches at the ISAP, International School of Analytical Psychology. He's a past president of the IAAP and has numerous articles and books that he's written. So without further ado, we will turn over to Murray.
Well, as Steve mentioned, we had to delay this series on the shadow and the problem of evil for several months, and now we are resuming our broadcasts. This is a follow-up or following on the series that we did about a year ago on Jung and world religions. And the two themes are somewhat connected in the sense that all world religions of any kind, of all varieties, do deal with this issue of the problem of evil. And in this series, we're going to focus on that specific topic, not so much from the position of world religions as from the point of view and the perspective of depth psychology and Jungian psychology. This topic of evil and what it is and where it is and how to identify it and what to do about it and does it exist, doesn't exist, doesn't it exist, or where is it in the world, is something that is occupying the collective tremendously throughout our world today because of all the violence that we see in the news, acts of terrorism, acts of war of all kinds, plus criminality and all these various topics that we're going to discuss in this series. So it's very much on our minds. And in this series, we're going to try to address various facets and features of this very much discussed current and topical issue. We see that violence and terror dominate the news almost to the exclusion of everything else. It's very unusual to see stories that are positive and upbeat in the world today. In other words, evidence of good in the world. We see much more evidence of violence and destructiveness and threat. And this, of course, can be thought of or questioned. Is this an eruption of the shadow and evil in our world? A kind of undercurrent that has always been there, now popping up and erupting, now in Paris, now in London, now in New York, now in the Middle East, now wherever in our homes and in our own neighborhoods. Is this an eruption of the shadow of collective consciousness, both in projection and in reality? And we're going to want to talk about the difference between the projection of evil and the shadow and shadow figures and symbols and so on, the projection factor and the reality factor. And how do we separate them? And how do we come to grips with reality and try to diminish the effects of projection that might interfere with our grasp on reality? So this is going to be one of our topics. But it's certainly the case that the evidence of shadow and evil seem to be very much in focus on the collective level today. Now, what is unconscious to us, we know, appears to us in projections. So to the extent that we are unconscious of evil in our own world or in ourselves, we're going to project it out into something else, into somebody else. And when this gets going in the form of projections, we have the familiar psychopathology called paranoia, which is the projection of shadow and evil into the world. And paranoia seems to take over where the sense of danger threatens, especially from the unknown and the unfamiliar, because that's where we project the unconscious into the unknown and the unfamiliar. My good friend Luigi Zoya has published a book recently on the subject of paranoia, a psychic factor that determines many events in the world. Often world leaders can get involved in paranoid projections and act on them, and this can change the course of history, as we know. But the very factor of otherness in a person or in a population, in a collective, strikes fear into the minds of individuals and collectives, and invites shadow projection. When you don't know who they are and there is some notion of threat in the air, as we experience it today, especially in Europe, I think, with a vast migration of foreign populations into these territories, there is a tremendous appearance of otherness on our streets and on our television screens and in our minds. And this invites shadow projections because we don't know who they are. We have a vague sense of threat that maybe they don't intend something constructive or in our benefit. And so we can begin to project some of the worst of our own shadow fantasies into their very otherness. And there are, of course, enactments of violence in response, the carrier of the projection will sometimes be activated. As we know, if you project evil onto somebody, they might, as a consequence of that very projection, start behaving in a nasty and bordering on criminal behavior fashion. So there is a kind of malicious cycle of projection and actual enactments of violence, what we might call evil, as we will discuss it in a moment, in our midst. And so this cycle of projection and enactment starts going, and we have a very difficult time finding a way to stop it or break into it. Now, these terms, good and evil, are being used in the public domain today in a way that I don't remember them from my days of youth, at least. I don't remember people speaking so much about good and evil. Of course, I was born in the midst of the Second World War, where there was presumably a lot of talk of good and evil, but I wasn't aware of it. And then the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on, its terms weren't used so much. But today, and what you see on your screen is a headline or the top of the Zurich newspaper, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, recent issue, just the other day, where it says, "Wo die Guten und wo die Bösen sind, ist im Nahen Osten nicht mehr klar." What that translates is, who is good, or where the good ones are, the good, and where the evil is, isn't clear to us in the Middle East anymore these days. It's hard to sort out who are the good guys and who are the bad guys over there. So these terms, gut und böse, good and evil, böse is the German word for evil, are terms that are very much on the tip of our tongue and in common parlance. So we are forced to reflect on what it is. What is evil and what is good? Just by virtue of living in our times. Now, I just did remember and looked up a couple of references concerning the rhetoric of evil in politics. And I think in modern times, in recent times, one of the first notable examples of that was in a speech that Ronald Reagan gave, President Reagan, in 1983, and it's known as the Evil Empire speech. This was a speech given to a group, originally to a group of fundamentalist Christians, an evangelical group in Florida, in which he referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And this phrase was picked up in the media, of course, and used a great deal to indicate President Reagan's moral evaluation of what was going on in communism and in the Soviet Union at that time. And of course, it was very upsetting to the other side to be labeled evil. Now, nobody wants to be evil or known as evil. Everybody wants to be good, and the other guy is the evil one. And President Reagan was famous for splitting the world into good and evil, and of course America was good, and the Soviet Union and the communist world was evil. But this terminology is a very moralistic terminology. It's almost medieval to speak of an evil empire or science fiction, something like that. But it was used in politics, brought into politics by Reagan, and since then, I think the rhetoric of evil in politics has continued. So, for example, President George W. Bush, in a speech in 2002, shortly after 9/11 and the attack on New York City, used a phrase called axis of evil. Axis of evil described three countries, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, who were promoting terrorism around the world, who presumably were seeking weapons of mass destruction. And President Bush chose to refer to their politics as an axis of evil. In other words, again, a moralistic, almost theological division of the world into those who favor good and those who favor evil. And so it has become very familiar in political discourse nowadays to speak of good and evil, a vocabulary and a language that is unfamiliar to modernity in many ways, where one tries to be much more neutral in one's language, more scientific, more rational. What is evil, after all? Is it just badness? Is it just people who don't like us, who are against us? Or is there more to it than that? And that's what we want to reflect on. And we will reflect on it mostly from a psychological point of view. Jungians, Jung himself, and those following him have taken up the subject of evil, or what we call the problem of evil. We will see already in the Red Book, Jung was dealing with that subject in his active imaginations and fantasies in that period of time, around 1913, 1914. And then in his writings after that, in a number of places, he did refer to the problem of evil, and he relates it to the psychological fact of the shadow aspect of the human personality, and we'll see how those things are connected. What does the human personality have to do with the problem of evil, and how is the problem of evil even a fundamental and essential consideration when we speak about the human personality and human beings as they operate at all levels, socially, politically, interpersonally, and so on our planet. So this is the title of a book that was written in 1961, edited, a series of essays by various members of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, Das Böse. And this is the translation of that book that appeared about 10 years later with a simple title, Evil. And you can see that some of the authors in the book are quite well known, others not as well known. And they approach the subject of evil from a number of perspectives. For instance, Karl Karinyi in that book writes on evil as it appears in mythology. Carl Schmitt writes about evil as it appears in sociology. Kurt Lewin writes about evil in philosophy. And Liliana Frey-Rohn, who was at that time a member of the curatorium of the Jung Institute, writes about the psychological aspects of evil. And I'm going to quote just a sentence or two from her essay. This opens her essay in the book. The title of her essay is Evil from the Psychological Point of View. And she writes, evil is a phenomenon that exists and has always existed only in the human world. So she is limiting the subject of evil to humanity. She's not going to consider evil as a natural phenomenon, which is sometimes done in theology and philosophy and so on, where evil can be a much broader category, but she's limiting it to the human world. Animals, she says, know nothing of it. So she isn't going to attribute any kind of evil to animals. even though they might be vicious, they might attack us, they might behave violently toward each other, but she's going to exclude the discussion of evil from the animal world and limit it to the human world. And then she goes on, but there is no form of religion, of ethics, or of community life in which it is not important, that is, evil, the topic of evil. So every form of religion considers it. And ethics is the attempt to sort out what is good and what is evil. Every human group on Earth has ever lived that we know of and can study has some sort of sense of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, way to behave toward oneself, toward others, toward the natural world, how to live in community, and so on. What is more, she writes, we need to discriminate between good and evil in our daily life with others. When we come into contact with other people and how we treat them, how we behave towards them, even how we think about them, these are ethical considerations. We have to discriminate between good and evil. Do we have good thoughts about somebody or evil thoughts about them? Do we say things and do things that are a mixture of these categories, good and evil? And as psychologists in our professional work, she says. So those of us who are psychotherapists and analysts often are confronted with issues in our clinical work that have to do with ethical matters, have to do with the behavior of our patients or of people who behave unethically or with malicious intent towards them, and sorting this out, trying to figure out what is projection, what is reality, is a part of our work. Is a person a victim of evildoers in their families or in their workplaces? Are they projecting evil onto others? Are they enacting evil towards others, toward their children, toward their partners or whatever? And this is a constant theme of reflection in our professional work. And then she says a caveat, and yet it is difficult to give a precise definition to what we mean psychologically by these terms, good and evil. And this is something that we're going to be thinking about a lot in this webinar series. What is the definition? How do we define, how do we pin down what we mean by evil? And we're going to want to leave it quite open. We're going to want to say it's the problem of evil, and that means it's problematic. It isn't easy to pin down exactly. It's a little bit like what the Supreme Court, when they were trying to decide on a definition of pornography, I think they were considering the case of Ulysses, James Joyce's work that was being banned from publication in the United States. And they finally concluded, you know, it's almost impossible to pin down a definition, an exact definition of pornography. But they said, you know it when you see it. And that's a bit the way it is with evil. Whether we can define it or not, when we see it, we are struck by something. And what is that? What is the feeling that we get when we are confronted by something that we would want to call out as evil? And of course, that also implies, what do we mean by good? Because good and evil are a pair of terms that really go together. They hang together. It's hard to define one without the other. It's certainly easier to define one if you have a grasp on the pair, and it helps you to sort out various degrees also of good and evil. It's a way of thinking. Now, before we proceed much further in this, I want to just remind us of what I'm going to call types of human consciousness. And I'm taking these 5, 6 types or levels of consciousness from a paragraph in Jung's work on the spirit Mercurius. And this is to try to sort out different ways of approaching the topic of good and evil, different levels of consciousness. And Jung gives us 5, I added a 6th because that's implicit in the rest of his work as well. But the first, he says, the first level, or the first, or one, let's say the first type of consciousness is what he calls participation mystique. And this is a type of consciousness in which there is no separation between self and object. It's a kind of unified world where psyche and objects are identified with each other, or we say that we are identified with the object. Now this is a term that Jung picked up from anthropology, sociology, and used it in his thinking about how projection and what we nowadays call projective identification works, where we as human beings are so closely identified with an object that we can't separate ourselves from the object. And this is often at quite an unconscious level, that objects affect us deeply, and maybe we also affect objects in our environment through this participation mystique. This is sometimes associated also with early childhood, where the infant might not be able to separate self, doesn't have a sense of self yet, as separate from the object world around that he or she sees, the mother's body, the various objects that are presented, and feels at one with these objects, as though these objects just belong to his or her world. Now, in anthropology, this level of consciousness is often related to animism, or in primitive religions, where objects have powers, or mana. You know, there might be a very powerful stone, or a Chiringa stone, as in some native groups, I think Australian Aborigines, the Chiringa stone is a very powerful stone, and it can affect magically other objects around it, and even people. So the power that objects have inheres in the object itself, and there is no distinction between the power the object has and the object. The object is itself a power object. Then a second stage of consciousness, Jung says the second stage of consciousness, we can just say another stage of consciousness, because we all have all of these. We all are in participation mystique without knowing it much of the time. I think with other people and with various objects in our environment, if something happens to the object, we get sick, or it has the object has a powerful effect on us and other people. So we all have all of these, but at the second stage, there's a distinction is made. A first distinction, let's say, between the object and the powers that inhabit the object, maybe occasionally inhabit the object. And these powers, gods or goddesses, are seen as different and distinct, that is transcendent. They live in a metaphysical realm, but they might enter into an object occasionally. For instance, temples. In classical mythology, the gods and goddesses will occasionally reside in a temple, in a statue. Might not always be there, but occasionally they are there. But they are not limited to the object. They exceed the object in their ontology, in their reality. They have their own standing. If the object is destroyed, they're not destroyed. These are transcendent spirits, and this is the world of classical mythology, we say projection is taking place. This isn't projective identification anymore. It's not the person identifying with the object or the object and the power being one. It's we project various powers into the object, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the goddess or god cries or nods its head or can do something amazing. Sometimes they don't. So there's a kind of autonomy in the spirit world now, and it's separated from the object world, the mythological type of consciousness. And then Jung says there's another stage, another type of consciousness where good and evil enters, and this is our topic. And this good and evil resides in the spirit. There are good spirits and there are bad spirits. This is still quite mythological. It's very characteristic of the European Middle Ages, where nature and the countryside were inhabited by spirits and ghosts and demons and goblins. And if you go out at night, you want to be very careful that you don't go into the realm of the bad spirits, because they can possess you and do bad things to you, make you sick, trip you up. Some are good. They can help you. They're good animals. They're bad animals in fairy tales, for instance. And these spirits still all exist outside of the human psyche. They're external. They live in another realm, a spirit realm, have their own metaphysical reality. But this distinction between good and evil now has come into play. And you see this in biblical religion for sure, that there are idols, there are bad powers, bad spirits, there are good spirits. Ultimately, Jehovah, the God, can rule over all the spirits, but they have a certain degree of existence of their own, and they can thwart God's will and so on. So there are good ones and there are bad ones. And human beings are in a position to make a judgment about them. So we judge, is it good? Is it a bad spirit? If it's a good one, it will help us. If it's a bad one, it will hurt us. And some of these evil spirits really intend very bad things. Witches, for instance, they want to do evil for its own sake. They have a kind of malicious spirit that enjoys hurting and harming and causing trouble. And so we begin to get a sense of evil as a separate power unto itself. And in some religions, you get a very strong sort of dualistic setup where there's a good God and an evil God, and they're in an eternal struggle with one another, and you don't know who's going to win in the end. The evil one wants destruction, and the good one wants a creation. And so human beings have been occupied with this sense of good and evil spirits for millennia, for as long as we can practically find records. As long as civilization has existed, and probably long before that. And then we come to the Enlightenment and modernity in the West, and there's a denial, complete denial of metaphysical reality of any spirits, good, bad, indifferent, gods, demons, doesn't matter. They don't exist. Only material reality exists. And material reality is subject to scientific measurement and discovery. And if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. If you can't smell, taste, touch it, it doesn't exist. And so that whole world was considered superstitious. All religions were considered based on sheer fantasy and projection, non-existent, scraped away, reality scraped clean of all of that. And now we have demythologization of nature and of the world, rationalism, and scientific accounts of behavior. This is modernity. And that is where medicine and psychiatry and so on have their home traditionally. That psychiatry tries to account for behavior not on the basis of good and evil spirits inhabiting us or getting into us, doing things to us, but on the basis of our genetic makeup, on the basis of our acculturation, of our childhood, on the basis of our medical health, on the basis of our neural networks, and so on and so forth. And so the terms good and evil disappear from the discussion in this scientific literature, in this scientific worldview. And that's why it's so strange that it's coming back in the popular mentality again, which obviously does not adhere to this scientific worldview totally. As soon as the discussion of good and evil re-enters, we're into another territory. Now, Jung takes us one step further and says, yeah, you can decide that the metaphysical reality of these spirits doesn't exist. It's just fantasy, but it is fantasy, and fantasy counts. Fantasy is important, and when you delve into the unconscious, you realize that these spirits and goblins and good and bad figures, Jung will call them archetypal figures, do exist, but they don't exist the way we thought they did back in medieval times and so on, but they exist in our psyches. So it's a discovery, or it's almost as though the telescope is turned around, and instead of looking out into the skies and finding the gods and goddesses out there in the constellations, turn the telescope around and you look into the inner world and you find the same thing. What the mythologies did was inscribe in the heavens the human psyche. And now we're not going to look for it in the heavens anymore, we're going to look for it in the psyche itself. And this is the reality of the psyche. The spirits have psychic reality, but they live in the world of the unconscious. That world of the unconscious is every bit as real and powerful as in medieval times it was thought the metaphysical world was real and powerful. And even to the extent that we can be possessed by these powers, these inner powers, we now can call complexes, archetypes, archetypal images, and so on, forces, psychic forces. We can be possessed by them to the extent that we lose our powers of discrimination, our ego consciousness, normal ego consciousness can disappear, and we can be taken over by a fantasies of the world that we swear are real because we're projecting them, and we're experiencing them, and we create a narrative and an account of reality based on these fantasies that are as realer than real. And so the subject of the existence of good and evil has shifted locations. Now we aren't talking about good and evil out there in the metaphysical world. We're talking about good and evil in the psychic world. And finally, the sixth stage of consciousness that Jung implies, writes about in his late writings, we can call it the unus mundus, world of synchronicity. Again, one world, a kind of recapitulation of the first level, participation mystique world, but at the level of consciousness now, much more conscious and even philosophical. And this is a sense that these inner figures that Jung called archetypes and archetypal images are not only psychic and human, but also mimic or reflect or correspond to structures of reality that are beyond the psyche and beyond the human world, that really are ontological, ontologically grounded. And in that case, if that's true, what would good and evil be in that world, in that unus mundus? Can we speak about reality as a composite of constructive and destructive powers and forces, and that our experience of good and evil, are a kind of echo of that, or a recapitulation on a human psychological level. So those are some fundamental considerations that we'll want to keep in mind as we go into this very deep subject of the problem of evil. Now, it has come back into psychiatry, this term evil, not as a metaphysical principle, but as a psychiatric principle. And here's the cover of a text that I found recently. It was published in 2010, called Forensic Psychiatry, Influences of Evil. So you see that it would seem that the topic of evil had been eliminated from the world of scientific, medical descriptions of human behavior, but now it's coming back. And this is a book that includes a number of essays in which the subject of evil is brought into a kind of psychiatric reflection. For instance, an archaeology of the psychopath, the medicalization of evil, it's called. The comforts of evil, dangerous personalities in high security hospitals in the horror film. Madness, badness, and evil. And a very fine essay by Stein, who may be known to some of us as he's a kind of combination of existentialist, existential psychologist and Jungian psychologist. Stein Diamond, who's worked for many years in forensic psychiatry in California. His essay is entitled Violence as Secular Evil, Forensic Evaluation and Treatment of Violent Offenders from the Viewpoint of Existential Depth Psychology. And I can recommend that article especially highly for a very sensitive sorting out of various degrees and levels of what we might call evil within the forensic world. And this will be a topic that will be discussed in the next webinar by Dr. Sarah Stein, who is a specialist in forensics and criminal justice. And the study of the criminal mind brings us very quickly to a feeling that we're dealing with something that would, on a human level, be normally called evil. Now, Stein Diamond quotes from Rollo May. Rollo May was an existential psychologist with a strong interest in Jung and Jungian psychology as well. Worked for many years in New York and had a strong following as one of the founders of the third type of psychotherapy, so-called humanistic psychology in the United States. And he uses the term daimonic, not demonic, daimonic, which softens the term a little bit. Demon is a traditional term referring to an evil power, a demon, angel of the devil or something, a demon. But he uses the word daimonic. And daimonic is simply derived from Greek, meaning a powerful spirit that can inhabit us, that can speak to us, that can come to us and inspire us or possess us. And here's what he writes about the daimonic. He says, any natural function which has the power to take over the whole person. So a kind of state of possession. This is a natural function, and he names a couple of them. Sex and eros, for instance. They can take over a person and completely dominate the person for good or ill. Anger and rage, another kind of strong emotional states, and the craving for power are examples. These are things that we all have to some extent or other, but when it becomes a force that takes over, it becomes daimonic, as he says. The daimonic can be either creative or destructive. So it can go either way, and certainly creative people know this power. My teacher, Harold Bloom, Yale University, has recently written a book on the daimon nose, and it's an account of American literature from the point of view of the daimonic. The daimonic as a power of creative power, an inspiring power, but also potentially a destructive one that inhabits many poets and creative writers. And so this daimonic can be very creative, can elevate the spirit, can inspire, or it can go in the opposite direction and become extremely destructive. And he says, and is normally both. So creation and destruction, also in mythology and mythological systems, often go together. That there is a creative and there's a destructive force, and they alternate or they work with each other. There's no creative without destructive, and so on. He goes on, when this power goes awry, and one element usurps control over the whole personality, what we would call a state of possession by an archetypal power, we have daimonic possession, the traditional name through history for psychosis. So here he's bringing in psychiatry. Of course, he's a modern psychologist who knows the nomenclature of psychiatry very well, all the categories of diagnosis. Psychosis is most severe form of mental disruption. And Jung diagnosed it also, or described psychosis as a state of possession and archetypal power takes over the personality. The ego is helpless, if at all conscious anymore. And this daimonic possession takes over the whole personality. Everything else falls to the wayside. The daimonic is obviously not an entity. Now here, Rollo May is asserting his modernity. It's not an entity. It doesn't exist in a metaphysical world, but refers to a fundamental archetypal function. In other words, it brings it inward. Daimonic is a fundamental archetypal function of human experience and existential reality. This is quoted by Stephen Diamond in his article, Violence is Secular Evil. It's a kind of secularization, you could say, a secularization of what was once discussed within a religious context. Evil was in the Middle Ages, pre-Enlightenment days, and to some extent to this day, even with fundamentalist religionists of all sorts. They believe that evil is a metaphysical power. What this book is trying to do is locate it also in the secular world and remove it from its religious connotations from the discussion. Here's another recent title published just this year, a very fine volume called Humanizing Evil. Again, you see this movement toward taking the discussion away from the theological, the metaphysical, the mythological element, aspect of it, or references, and bringing it into the human. And here you have the subtitle, Psychoanalytic, Philosophical, and Clinical Perspectives. And very fine essays, and they're very up-to-date in their research and their thinking, very sophisticated and subtle. I can recommend this book very highly. And it certainly gives us a very good purchase on the subject that we're discussing. Now, to the etymology of the word evil. This is from an article in that book, Humanizing Evil, by Michael Stone, The Psychodynamics of Evil. And he gives us a definition, I think, that we can very easily relate to. It's very down to earth, and it gives us a feeling You know, if we want to identify the feeling that we get when we face what we will call evil, this is, I think, a good beginning point for that reflection. He says, evil is a word answering to an emotion. So he's going to want to say, you have a certain emotion, you put a name on it, evil. Specifically, the emotion of horror and revulsion when we hear of or we witness an action whose intention was to subject another person or a group of persons to extreme suffering, extreme humiliation, degradation, and often enough, dehumanization. So when we see that, whether we see it in a film, whether we see it on the streets, on our television, on the news, whenever we witness something like that, what comes to our mouth immediately is, this is evil. He says there is something excessive, over the top, way beyond what can be accepted in the body social, in our usage of the word evil. It's excessive. It goes beyond just being bad, being naughty. And this reflects its origin etymologically. And this is interesting. Our word is a latter-day version of the Anglo-Saxon Yifil, itself a cognate of the German words über and übel. Now, über means like over or beyond. That is something, in other words, that tramples on the social bond that unites us. But this über, it's gone over. It's gone over the boundary. It's gone over the edge. That feeling that this is too much, when we see that, when we witness it, our sensitivity tells us this is über, this is evil, evil. That's where the word comes from. It's too muchness. It's excessive. Now, there was an interesting reflection on evil in 1961 by Hannah Arendt. Eichmann in Jerusalem is the title of her book. And she is, it was a very, very controversial book. Stirred up huge amounts of discussion and disagreement and upset by the way she talked about witnessing the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem. But in the end, she sat through this trial, which not only put Eichmann on trial, but put the Nazis in general on trial. The whole Holocaust was reviewed in this very long trial, and it was sickening, it was horrifying, it was all that we would say, what springs to your mouth is evil. This was, if there ever was evil, this was evil. And she sat there and she listened through the whole thing, and she came to a very, very strange conclusion, a very disturbing conclusion. Here's what she said. This is the last paragraph of her book. These were essays, reports from Jerusalem as the trial was going on, published in the New Yorker magazine. And here's what she says at the very end. She says, Adolf Eichmann went to the gallows with great dignity. He was in complete command of himself. Nay, he was more. He was completely himself, as he was throughout the whole trial. He was always very composed and rational. It was as though in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness, that is the trial, was a course in human wickedness, as you saw all the events of the Holocaust before your eyes, had taught us the lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil. And that phrase, the banality of evil, stuck in the craw of so many people. How can you say evil is banal when it's so excessive, it's so dramatic, it's so violent? But when looking at Eichmann, who was one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, she could see that he was drawn into a scheme. He was a bureaucrat, he was a rational man, He was power-driven. He was daimon possessed by the power drive. But he carried all this out in such a cool spirit, such a organized, civil, legal, by the book spirit, that in the end you could only say, he's a banal man, he's doing evil, and the whole thing is a banality. The banality of evil. It was a shocking phrase to think of evil in this way, but something I think that we really need to keep in mind, because evil isn't always so dramatic. It can be very subtle indeed. It can be participation in a very legally constructed system where one is breaking no laws, one is doing one's duty, and one is serving something that is at bottom rooted in horrific evil. Now, a term that's sometimes used is radical evil. Radical evil is what a counterpart to the banality of evil, you could say. And this is from Julia Kristeva, who's a French psychoanalyst, who's recently written an article in the that's published in the IPA website, the International Psychoanalytic Association. And she's writing after these attacks in Paris last year, the two attacks that took the lives of many innocent people and shocked everybody in the world, but particularly the French, and she lives in Paris, and she was in the middle of it, similar to what happened in New York on 9/11, the shocking violence that one witnessed, the destruction. And she's thinking about these attacks in Paris on the part of radical Islamic fundamentalists, Islamists. And she writes, what is radical evil? It is the declaration and the realization of the superfluity of human beings. Human beings don't matter. You can kill them without remorse, without thought. They're superfluous. They're extras. The superfluity of human beings, their mechanical destructiveness. So this mechanical destructiveness, she calls radical evil. It's what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. Eichmann also was radically evil, but mechanically destructive. So this is something to keep in mind as we think about evil and what is it? And radical evil, that's over the top evil. Now we're going to look at the concept of the shadow. And this is a Jungian term. Jung came up with this sometime in the 1920s to talk about, as the subtitle says, the title of this book, Meeting the Shadow, the hidden power of the dark side of human nature. Now, the dark side of human nature, that's the shadow side. And the shadow has many degrees, from relatively mild, little sins to big sins, to all the way down to radical evil. And we're going to locate that power in the human personality in a place called the shadow. Shadow is an aspect of the human personality, all of you Jungians know this well, that resides just below the surface of ego consciousness, and it's very close, according to Jung's definitions, to what Freud called the id. And the id is a very destructive force within the psyche indeed that has to be mastered, has to be controlled, has to be monitored at all times in order not to create unconscious enactments of the shadow, because the shadow is unconscious. So what we do to a certain extent in shadow enactments is the banality of evil. We don't even know we're doing it. We do it quite unconsciously, and only in retrospect and thinking deeply about what we've done, thought or said, do we realize that it was an enactment of some part of ourselves that isn't so nice, that has to do with destruction and hatred and envy and so on, we will talk about in a moment. So evil in the shadow. Jung writes, the shadow has personal and archetypal dimension. And he writes, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature. We can all shrug our shoulders and say, oh yeah, we've got a bad side, who doesn't? So it's relatively easy to recognize that, pull it up, especially if somebody else tells you about it. If you've got a good stomach, you can face it and recognize it and say, yeah, I'm sorry, I really did that, I shouldn't have. It's not so easy, actually, but he says it's relatively, it's quite within the bounds of possibility for a man, a person, to recognize the relative evil of his nature, because we're all selfish, we're all egotistical, and so on. But it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. And here Jung uses that term, absolute evil, by which he means archetypal evil. He means something beyond what we face in our social life on a daily basis. But absolute evil is looking into the pit, into the abyss. Radical evil, as Kristeva spoke about it, and to actually face that as a shattering experience, according to Jung. He writes this in Ion. This is the last sentence of his chapter titled The Shadow. Now we're going to go into biblical mythology for a little bit to think about, where does evil come from? And what is its origin? The Bible offers a very dramatic mythological account of this. Very few parts of the Bible are explicitly mythological. It's a lot of its history, a lot of its teaching, prophecy, prayers, stories, and so on. But the beginning is clearly a mythological account of the creation of the world, the creation of man. In God's image, man was created, man and woman created he them in his own image. And they were placed in the Garden of Eden. And this is a place of participation mystique, you could say, certainly a place where there is no problem of, no consideration of good and evil. Everything is fine. And they're living in paradise, which is something we all want. We think we want. Maybe we don't want it as much as we think we do. You get it, and it becomes like a golden cage. The problem with the golden cage, the child born into extreme privilege, has everything he wants, will do something at some point to break out of that cage. And that's what happens in the Garden of Eden. There is a serpent in the Garden of Eden. Now, God created all the animals. God created human beings, all the animals, all the plants. And one of the animals that he created was a serpent. So there's a serpent in there. Why not? Don't have to worry about any animals. They aren't going to hurt you. Serpent is a friendly animal in paradise. Doesn't bite you, isn't poisonous, but very subtle. Now comes the thought. We could say a thought occurs to Eve in the form of the serpent whispering in her ear. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. Subtle. The serpent is subtle. So this is a very subtle thought. This is not a thought that hits you over the head. It whispers in your ear. It's just the beginning. It's a little temptation. It's just a doubting thought. And he said to the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Of course, this is the beginning, because even in paradise, this potential for what we will see eventually turn into evil exists. This is the beginning of the story of the existence of good and evil, and it's just a whisper. And we could say that according to this mythological account, evil must be archetypal. It's there in the beginning. Jung said in response to Victor White, who was claiming that God was all good, Jung hated the doctrine of privatio boni, that evil is only the absence of good, and God is all good, summum bonum. And so he said to Victor White, well, what about the serpent? Who put the serpent in the garden? Why did God put a serpent there? Why didn't God foresee what was going to happen? So he's pinning the problem of evil right into the beginning of archetypal structure itself. The beginning, the foundation, already shows a little crack, shows this doubting thought. Well, that doubting thought comes to a person who's becoming a bit conscious. She's wondering, why did he say that we shouldn't eat of all the trees? There are 2 trees there that look so good. Why can't we eat of those? The tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life. And so the serpent just subtly implies, well, maybe he said it, maybe he didn't really mean it, but we know where this leads. And we know also that every attempt at creating paradise on earth, all utopian fantasies, have failed. It's inevitable that they will fail, because there is something in human beings, in the very structure of the human psyche, this little thought that doesn't want to obey the authority, that wants to do something a little different, that wants to question, that wants to doubt, that wants to experiment. Here's a wonderful picture by the painter Cranach, the elder Adam and Eve with the serpent in Eden, and you see them innocently taking a bite of the apple. Now this reach of curiosity, which is very innocent, and children have it, infants have it already, reaching out to touch, the reach of curiosity, but the reach that extends beyond the limits of the permitted. And we're all fascinated by what's beyond the permitted. This is the temptation to experience for oneself what authority prohibits and forbids. This is desire. This is the anima, the animus, the reaching out for something, the forbidden fruit. What does it taste like? Satan said, which the Lord God had made. Satan, who was made, is the tempter. He's the tempting thought. And this impulse to go beyond the boundaries that authority sets is the source of the independent ego, the autonomous, willful I that is born through disobedience. And this act of disobedience brings about the knowledge of good and evil. If she hadn't disobeyed, if she hadn't tempted Adam to disobey, they would have not had the knowledge of good and evil. By knowledge, it means experience in the Bible. Knowledge is a word. To know someone is to have sexual intercourse with them. It's to know them intimately. It's to know by experience. So this isn't just cognitive knowledge. Somebody tells you what is evil, don't do it. This is the experience of it. And once you have the experience of it, once you have stepped over the boundary, once you have taken a bite out of the forbidden fruit, then you have knowledge of evil. And that brings with it shame, disgust, a bad conscience, and that's why they cover themselves. So that is the knowledge of good and evil, but it is what God has. And God says to them, well, we'll see what he says in a moment, but taken to its extreme, going to the extreme, over the top, über, and beyond the boundaries of all laws and ethics, this development becomes more than just normal ego, and it becomes egotism, and eventually ends up in narcissism, in cold selfishness, self-indulgence. And if you end up there, the people who end up there, or the part of us that ends up there, is what Jung will call absolute evil. That is a kind of foundational narcissism without anything to balance it, without altruism, without caring for objects, without caring for others, to relate to the world only from this position of the willful I is the foundation of the pathological character that we call a psychopath or a sociopath. Here's Michelangelo's depiction of Adam and Eve and the serpent, and you can see the serpent tempting and the angel thrusting them out of the garden. Now, this also has to do with the etiology of the shadow. How does the shadow come into being? The shadow implies a division of the psyche between conscious and unconscious factors, between the ego and the id in Freud's terms. There is a split in the psyche, and this division comes about in the course of development. It's not there at the beginning, it's not there in the infant, it's not there in the stage of participatio mystique, the world is one, and so on. So what is gained by the act of disobedience? Here's God's word. And the Lord God said, behold, the man has become as one of us to know good and evil. You become sort of godlike through this act of disobedience. You know the difference between good and evil, and you really know it. And God says he's become as one of us, implying several gods, at least, in the book of Genesis. Now, this knowledge of good and evil implies a consciousness now that can discriminate. And this is level 3, discriminate between good and evil, and also good and evil in oneself, and therefore one that can also choose. Until you know the difference and really know it, you aren't in a position to really choose. And this sets the stage for the creation of the shadow, which is constructed from identification with the good and repression of the bad. We want to be good, we identify with good values, we want to be obedient to our parents, we want to please them, most of us want to be nice young people, we want to be good citizens, we identify with all the virtues, and what happens to the other part of ourself, the other impulses, that gets repressed, puts into the unconscious, or not brought into consciousness sufficiently, remains in the unconscious. And so that is what makes up the shadow. And the psyche is now divided between conscious and the unconscious. So this is the origin of the shadow. The division, it rests on this discrimination between good and evil. I'm going to be good and I will reject evil because I know what it is. I'm ashamed of it. I'm going to cover myself. I'm going to try to behave myself a little better. And so in the course of time, the course of history and reflection, a list was established of virtues and vices, the so-called 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues that correspond to them. And this was a discrimination of moral character, of ethical values, and you can see how they match up with each other. There's chastity and lust. Lust is sexual excess. Chastity is renunciation of sexuality. And you have temperance versus gluttony. Temperance is dieting, not eating too much. Gluttony is just going all out. Charity versus greed. Charity being taking care of other people, being generous, being kind, being altruistic. Greed is the opposite, looking out for yourself only, selfishness. Diligence versus sloth. Diligence means you're hardworking. Sloth means you're lazy and dependent and depressed. And so patience versus wrath. Patience means long-suffering. You can take a lot, you can wait. Wrath is striking out in anger, rage. Kindness versus envy. Again, a pair of opposites. And humility versus pride. Now, here you have a picture of humility versus pride. And you see these 2 women. The one on the right is pride. She's all dressed up. She has beautiful clothes, ornaments, jewelry. And the one on the left is modest, humble, quite the opposite. So here is a pair. Now, this leaves us with the shadow forces. And the shadow forces is a pretty good description of them. And we have to contend with them. They don't go away. Just because we identify with the good, In fact, the more we identify with the good, in a way, the more active they become in the unconscious. And their activity in the unconscious can lead to dreams, it can lead to fantasies, it can lead to enactments and acting out, where our grip on virtue just simply disappears. We lose our inhibitions and then we act out. So if we go through this list, we can see what we face in the shadow forces. Freud wrote quite a bit about the first one, sexuality, lust. Then, of course, there's gluttony. These are the eating disorders, gorging and vomiting and so on, just not being able to get enough. Greed is selfishness and egocentricity, going into severe narcissism. Sloth is pathological dependency on other people, not wanting to carry one's own weight. Childishness. Wrath is anger, narcissistic rage states, rage disorder. Envy, borderline malice, and pride would be pathological narcissism. So you see quite a lineup of forces in the shadow. And here's a painting of the 7 deadly sins, quite an elaborate mandala. You could say this is a shadow mandala showing the inner world of a virtuous, God-fearing person. Now, in recent discussions of evil, violence has been located as one of the essential features or outbreaks, you could say, of evil. Violence is a topic of much discussion in our world today. And we can go back to the biblical account and look at the etiology of violence there as well. What happens when Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden? They do have children, and one pair of children are Cain and Abel. And Cain is an agricultural person, and Abel is a shepherd. And they offer sacrifices to the Lord. And the Lord is not equal in his treatment of these sacrifices. Here's what the text says. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou dost well, shalt thou not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. If thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. It's waiting. The shadow is waiting. And unto thee shall be his desire, that is, sin's desire is going to come after you, and thou shalt rule over him. So you better take into account the sin that's lying at the door and see if you can rule over this shadowy impulse. But Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. So here you have the first act of violence. What starts in the garden as this subtle thought, a little bit of curiosity, breaking the rules, leads to being sent out of the garden, out of paradise, separated from the authority figure, separated from God. Say the ego self-axis is broken there. It has to be broken in order for the ego to grow and develop. But then what you get is this problem of the brothers and of violence. And the etiology of violence lies right here. Cain slaying Abel. This is the first murder. So murderous rage enters into the one whose sacrifice is not accepted by God. Moshe Habertal, very fine scholar, biblical scholar, Israeli author, wrote a fine book I can recommend called On Sacrifices, which is a long reflection on the whole issue of sacrifice in Old Testament, New Testament, and in other areas of life. And he writes, why Cain's offering was refused is a mystery. The text does not provide any substantive reason. This silence is significant. It is essential to this form of rejection. Cain is rejected, that it remains inexplicable, as if nothing could be done to either predict or overcome it. The privileging of Abel and dismissal of Cain seem to be as mysterious as human love and endearment. This unpredictable nature of love turns into a theme that haunts the entire book of Genesis. Throughout the book of Genesis, you have this theme of the one who's privileged and the one who isn't, the one who's chosen and the one who isn't, the struggles for inheritance, and it all comes out of this mysterious unpredictability of human love and endearment. We simply love some of our children more than others. We try not to. We try to be equal, but that seems to come across. And out of this, you have the narcissistic rage that overwhelms Cain. And this is the source of pathological violence. Narcissistic rage, which is born out of deep sense of rejection and not being accepted, not being as good as, not being as loved as. And this you get in many accounts of why people turn violent, why they commit murder, why they become radicalized in our world today. It's out of this feeling of not being among the privileged, not being accepted, not being chosen, being in a country that's hostile and privileges others. And so this narcissistic rage, we could say, is the source of pathological violence. This is a quote from Heinz Kohut about narcissistic rage belongs to the large psychological field of aggression, anger, and destructiveness, and occurs in many forms. They all share, however, a specific psychological flavor which gives them a distinct position within the wide realm of human aggression. This is all about evil now. The need for revenge, for righting a wrong, for undoing a hurt by whatever means. This need for revenge, righting a wrong. I mean, and we see this often in the victims of violence as well, for undoing a hurt by whatever means, an early life trauma and so on, and a deeply anchored, unrelenting compulsion in the pursuit of all these aims, which gives no rest to those who have suffered a narcissistic injury. These are the characteristic features of narcissistic rage in all its forms, and which sets it apart from other kinds of aggression. And we could say this is the source of pathological violence and one of the deepest, darkest forms of what we react to with the term evil. Now, I just discovered this the other day. The medical scientific world is also looking into the issue of rage and the ability to control anger, to master anger, to somehow override our angry impulses and contain them. And this is research that's been done on the brain, and the finding is that individuals with rage disorder have smaller volumes in brain areas linked to emotion. That there is a correlation between a certain development of the brain, the absence of some volume, small volume in certain brain areas linked to emotion, that is correlated with what is called rage disorder. And this was a study of people who experienced road rage in Chicago. This is from Science Life, the University of Chicago Medicine and Biological Sciences magazine. The brains of people convicted of road rage were studied, and it was found that they have typically and characteristically smaller development, smaller volume of a mass of material in certain areas of the brain that's linked to emotion. So there is a biological feature. Does this exonerate them? Does this excuse the road rage? Not in a court of law. They're going to have to find a way to work around this, and maybe there will someday be a stem cell treatment for this to grow a little more brain mass in that area. Now, shadow dynamics, Jung comments on his issue, on his chapter on the shadow in Ion, and he says close examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly an obsessive, or better, possessive quality. Affects occur usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. On this lower level, with its uncontrolled or scarcely controlled emotions, one behaves more or less like a primitive who is not only passive victim of his affects, but also singularly incapable of more judgment. So this is the kind of person you'd find committing road rage, and the reason for this weakness, this outburst of shadow rage. This might otherwise be a very nice person, a very even kind person, a thoughtful person, but at certain moments his buttons are pushed, his inferiorities are touched, and he's in a situation that constellates this outbreak of violence on the road. Now, the shadow is unconscious, it's unrecognized, it's the rejected part of ourselves. Partly it's sexual, partly it's will to power, and all the other features that we've talked about. And these can erupt, possess, and they can become violent. And when they become violent, we have this reaction that's an outbreak of evil. The problem of evil has presented itself. And tradition teaches us that wrath, that the three deadly sins, the last three, wrath, envy, and pride, are the most dangerous and intractable of the deadly sins. They are the hottest buttons, and these summon the energies of absolute evil. That would be narcissistic rage, the need for revenge under wrath, envy, there's a borderline malice, a very dark and relentless kind of malicious thought and feeling and behavior, and pride, narcissistic entitlement. And these are the most difficult to get on top of, to control, and to become conscious of and master of the seven deadly sins. So it fits in very well with modern psychiatric determinations. Now, what happens if we are trapped in the shadow world? If we become possessed by the shadow, we create a world of projection. And Jung writes about this as a kind of cocoon. A cocoon is being spun. He says the effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. So, say the shadow is stimulated, you begin painting the world in dark colors, you see destructive people and evil plotting people against you all over the place, you become paranoid, and you get cut off from reality. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. So you're looking at your shadow world as you look out into the world and see all this evil coming at you. In the last analysis, they lead to an autoerotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. So there is an ideal world somewhere that is forever unattainable. There's a real world that is nasty and horrible, and you're the victim of it. It is an unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world. And what is being spun is a cocoon which in the end will completely envelop him. And there you have a paranoid personality, and the world becomes hell on earth. There is nothing good in this world. And this person is completely suffocated and taken over by the activation of the shadow and its projection into the world outside and around. The Jungian discussion of evil took a very deep and sophisticated and sensitive turn in the work of Erich Neumann when he wrote Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. This text will be discussed in the session with Henry Abramovich to some extent, but what it amounts to is his warning that if one identifies too one-sidedly with the virtues and represses the vices, the bad parts of the self, and projects those out, one creates scapegoats in the world. One creates a world in which there are bad people all over, and if one can just get rid of them, the world will be better. And as soon as that one's gotten rid of, there will be another one, and so on. And he advocates for a new ethic, which is an ethic of more consciousness, becoming aware of one's own shadow, not projecting it as much, and therefore having a better grasp on reality. Some years ago, I put together a collection of Jung's writings on the subject of evil called Jung on Evil. That's still available from Princeton University Press. And Jung wrote quite a lot about evil throughout his whole career. If you want to read about it, you can get that book. It was a topic very much on his mind, and especially after the Second World War. And he also writes about the shadow of God, because he wants to include, he wants a definition of God, or a God image that is inclusive, doesn't split good and evil, doesn't create a paranoid world, but that unites and integrates these two parts of reality that, as I said, do seem to belong not only to the human world, the psychological world, but to the whole cosmic setup. And here's a picture from the Red Book where he paints this picture, and the written above the picture in German, it says, "This is the golden fabric in which the shadow of God lives." Mary Louise von Franz wrote an interesting book called The Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. It's in two parts. The second part is especially on the topic of evil, and she talks about how to deal with evil, how to face it, how to confront it. What do fairy tales tell us about how to deal with evil when we face it? And the question comes, are we free to choose good or evil? There is, of course, the rational philosopher Immanuel Kant says yes. When Kant speaks of the radical evil in human nature, he is referring to the specific character of human nature being able to direct itself with reason and freedom toward good or evil. For Kant, one can make a choice. You follow the principles of good, or you choose to follow evil. Jung, as a depth psychologist, isn't so sure that that's even possible, because evil is so subtle, evil is banal, we're sometimes involved in it unconsciously in enactments if we're not fully aware of our own shadow. So it's a much more difficult project than simply making up your mind to affirm good against evil, as Kant would have us do. Now, in the outline of this series, just briefly, next time we will focus on the criminal mind and criminality in society with Sarah Stein. Then we're going to talk about cultural evil, the quest for dominance. This would be in the world of nations and politics, world politics, with Ariel Shalit, Jungian analyst from Israel. The symbolism of evil with Mary Tomlinson. She will find and present symbols from myths, fairy tales, popular culture today, film, and comic books and whatnot. She's collecting all kinds of symbols of evil. And then there will be a session with Henry Abramovich, Jungian analyst from Jerusalem, good friend of mine. And we will have a dialogue on the responsible self, as we call it, using some of Neumann's ideas about shadow awareness and the new ethic. And then finally, in our last session, we're going to deal with ecology, the shadow of humanity on the planet. And this is where our evil enactments can be very unconscious indeed, and once we become conscious, even deliberate, that we simply ignore what the consequences of our actions are on ecology and on the planet. And then as we consider all of this, I want to just close with a lovely quotation from Julia Kristeva's essay on interpreting radical evil. She writes, "In order not to bow down before evil," and she's writing from Paris, remember, a city that was overwhelmed by these evil enactments last year. In order not to bow down before evil or extreme evil, we must patiently continue researching, which is what we're doing, thinking about it. Certainly not from some unknown utopian and safe balance, but from this fragile point. In other words, participatory, involved, from this fragile point which Pascal defines as perpetual motion. He wrote, "He who found the secret to rejoicing in goodness without getting angry at evil would have found the point. It is perpetual motion." So it's a matter of keeping a balance between goodness and evil, and rejoicing in goodness even while we study something as dark and as dangerous and as off-putting and repulsive as some of the things that we're going to see in the course of these webinars in the future months to come. So with that, I would like to go back to the studio in Asheville and see if there are some questions. We have some time left for discussion if there would be any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Murray. What a wonderful kickoff to our series on the shadow and evil. That was just a marvelous overview with that. I'm sure it's gotten people thinking a fair amount. Go ahead and type out your questions into the question dialog box. We've already gotten a couple in already. I don't know if we've told our panelists, and I hope they're okay with this, but I'm going to invite them into the discussion if they'd like to do so. In just a moment, we'll be bringing in, I noticed Sarah Stein and Brigitte Egger are both online, and if they would like to comment at all, we would welcome their comments. Lionel Corbett, I noticed, also online. I didn't warn him of this either, but Lionel has published both on evil and gave a lecture to us on that topic. So Lionel, if you have any comments, feel free to do so. We'll be inviting the three of you in as panelists, and that'll allow you to unmute in just a moment or two if you decide to do so. In the meantime, as you all are typing in further questions, the first one I'd like to read, Murray, is a brief one. Is ISIS somehow different in its manifestation of apparent evil? Any thoughts on that piece?
The question is ISIS any different? Well, if you look at instances of evil enactments, that is, destructive, severely pathological, narrow-gauged enactments of destructiveness, I think one can find many, many examples that are as vicious as ISIS. What ISIS has is basically an ideology that's based on some interpretations of Islam. Most Islamic, by far the vast majority, reject these interpretations and these enactments, and I think it's driven by pathological narcissism. That is, the feeling of rejection in the world, in the broad global perspective, in the broad global picture. There is a terrible amount of resentment and rage at the secular world and all the values that it stands for. And a lot of these people who go to Syria and join up with ISIS, young people, are live in societies that maybe in the second generation, maybe with quite a few opportunities, even education, even careers, but do not feel that their sacrifice is accepted. I think you have a Cain and Abel story there. They are outraged by their by narcissistic wounding, and this produces, in combination then with some leadership and a lot of money and political forces, it produces a phenomenon in the world and throughout the world that is bent on destroying anything that does not line up with a very, very narrow understanding of what is tolerable and what is good in their eyes. So it is the definition of good and evil in which we are the evil ones. They are the good ones, and they're destroying evil. And they're doing it with a huge vengeance. But that isn't so different from what many other ideologies have done in the course of history. And even, you know, our own religions, biblical religions, have done at one time or another in the course of history.
Yeah, thank you. Feel free to type in those questions. I'm going to try to open a microphone or two. If not that you'll have to comment at all, feel free not to. Brigitte must be on a device that can't get a webcam. Brigitte, I'm going to open your microphone if you want to try, and if it doesn't work, don't worry about it. But Brigitte, are you there? Can you hear us? Nope, I'll close that one. We didn't warn her about this, so I apologize for that. Line, I'll do the same thing for you, just in case you have any comments. But again, don't feel like you have to. And then there is another question I'll be reading in a moment. Let me in the wrong section, sorry, a second. So Lionel's been muted. Lionel, hello, can you hear us, and do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I can hear you, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If you want to share a webcam, feel free to, or you can just stay on audio.
No, I'll stay on audio, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
What I'd like to ask Murray is about a tension that I read in Jung. In his essay on good and evil, he says that the question of good and evil is largely a matter of human judgment. We don't know their essential nature, their ontological nature. We make judgments about them. But then, of course, in answer to Job, he talks about the dark side of God, or the dark side of the self. If there is such a thing as the dark side of the self, this is much more than a matter of human judgment. Do you see that as a tension in his thinking?
I have, yes. I wrote about that in the introduction to the book on good and evil. It's part of level 3 that the judgment enters about whether the spirits are good or evil. One could say that the discrimination between good and evil does depend on a conscious judgment. Otherwise, we would simply be enacting random impulses and emotions and feelings and drives and so on. And when that judgment enters, then you start making choices. Without that judgment, you wouldn't make choices. Everything would be more or less on the same level. So whether the choice that one makes is actually for the good or for the evil is another question, very ambiguous, because you could say Eichmann was choosing the good. ISIS fighters are choosing the good as they judge it. But as the world judges it, it doesn't look that way. So this it leads to the question of the relativization of good and evil. Is there such a thing as absolute evil and absolute good? Or is it simply a question of where you sit, where you stand, whose side you're on? And I think when Jung pushes it to the archetypal level, and he wants to say, as he does in answer to Job, he wants to say that evil is a part of the totality of the self, of the God image. And he stays away from the question of God. He says God image. It's the same tension that you feel when he's talking about archetypes. Are these ontological figures and forms? Do they have a standing beyond our conception of them and our experience and the images of them? Or are they simply products of the human mind? And I think there is that tension in Jung. And I think he wants to say sometimes one thing leans toward one side and sometimes toward the other side. in his heart, I think he believed that they do have a basis beyond the human psyche, that the archetypes are rooted in nature, in the cosmos, and there is an archetype that we judge to be evil, that is, things that are deeply destructive, malicious, intentionally so, acting or thinking or feeling with evil intention toward others. I think he would say has its roots somewhere darkly, deeply in the self. And also, if it is in the self, there is no way to avoid it. That is one of Neumann's positions, finally, that you cannot avoid shadow enactments and evil enactments. It's built into the structure of the human. If you try to avoid it at all costs, you will live a very one-sided and neurotic life. As Jung said at one point, it's not healthy to be too good. It tips you over. You increase the tension between two parts of yourself to such a degree that you're in a level of deep conflict with yourself, which is the definition of neurosis. And so this attempt to individuate and to achieve some semblance of conscious wholeness requires a certain amount of recognition and even enactment, knowledge of evil. Knowledge comes about through experience and enactment, and you don't know it deeply until you have experienced it, and you experience the shock of it. Now, sometimes you experience that in a dream, or you experience that in a fantasy or in an emotion. You might not act on it, but you experience it deeply, or an act of imagination, as Jung did in the Red Book. That brings about the knowledge of it, which helps to ameliorate the enactments of it. But I think Jung felt it's deeply woven into the nature of humanity and into the nature of the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to, I know Dr. Sarah Stein is online. Sarah, I'm going to open up your microphone if you care to say something. You don't need to, and you might get feedback without earbuds. But let me open that in a moment, and we've got two other questions if we have time. But Sarah, are you there? Dr. Stein, can you? Welcome.
I'm here.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts today? Not that you have to, but any thoughts you want to add?
Well, I'd like to touch a little on what Murray said regarding Jung's concept of it's not healthy to be too good, and this is something that I'll touch on in my webinar next month, is that this is what we often find in these serial offenders, is that it's when they try and overcompensate their good side of themselves and try and control that shadow side of themselves when they become unpredictable. And that's when we see that level of violence rise. So I would say that is certainly an accurate finding.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's very interesting. And we will dwell quite a bit on that next time when we talk about the criminal mind, which maybe isn't such a different mind from our mind, but just a little less balanced or more problematical. But I think another point that Sarah will make next time is that there is a spectrum that we all share in to some extent, and so we don't want to divide the criminal mind off, separate it, and project onto it our own darkest thoughts and impulses. So to bring it into the discussion, we will try to see that it's on a spectrum of behavior and thought that can fall into what Rollo May called demonization, where the personality is overcome by an eruption from one of these shadow centers. And as Sarah says, the more you try to repress that and to be good, if it is a weakness in your psyche and a tendency, it will simply exacerbate the problem rather than help the problem.
All right, let me ask one of the listener questions. We've got a tad bit of time left. And Murray, if you need to leave right at one, let us know. And Sarah Stein, I'll keep your microphone open. I don't hear any feedback on it, so if you have any comments on the question, that's certainly good as well. This listener asks, why do you think humanity has succeeded in developing intellectually, that is, creating all the current technologies that unite our world in extraordinary communications or sophisticated methodologies of violence and destruction, and still we are seemingly stagnate when it comes to spiritual and emotional evolution, our inability to learn to love, to be compassionate, and so forth?
You know, this is a question that I think about all the time, and have had many discussions with people, and it comes down to, do you think the world is getting better, or is it getting worse, or are we staying more or less in the same place? Personally, I think humanity is increasing in consciousness, but it's with fits and starts, and it's by a bit of this and a bit of that and fallback, and I think with the development of social networks, and which can be demonized also, that can go either way, toward destruction, toward mobilizing destructive forces or mobilizing the contrary good forces, but in the end it will make possible a kind of consciousness on the planet of what's going on the planet and everybody's opinions about what's going on, that has the potential for uniting the world in a way it never has been or could have been before on the human level. And I will leave it to some of the other panelists to discuss this question. Are we getting better with regard to criminology? Is science improving our not only our understanding but our ways of dealing with young criminals, of rehabilitation of criminals, so on and so forth? Ecologically, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we standing in the same place? Ethically, in ethical discussions, I mean, there are so many areas where ethics is now being discussed, and for the first time because of new inventions, for instance, in medical science, stem cell research is one big area, other kinds of possible research areas that are questionable from an ethical point of view. That these questions are being asked, I think, is so important. And nobody's ever going to solve the world's problems and make it into a paradise. We're always going to have to deal with evil. It's written into the code. And if we can simply continue the discussion and the reflection, I think it, inch by inch, it brings about a greater consciousness. And we can't say the world is a hugely better place today than it was 1,000 years ago, but it is a different place, and I'd rather live in this world than in that one. I think to live in a mythological age is not as clear and as promising as living in a scientific and a modern age. So I'm of the persuasion that while we've lost some things, valuable things, we can recover them in modernity through psychology, depth psychology. We can recover spirituality and religion and mythological insights and so on. We can recover all of that. We don't have to have lost it, but we get it on another level. And I think that new level is much more promising for the future than the regressive attempts. ISIS is a regressive attempt to go back to the 7th century. Fundamentalism is a regressive attempt to go back to pre-modern times and so on. I don't think those are going to succeed, and I don't think they should succeed. I think there's another way forward, and I'm relatively optimistic about it. Relative.
Well, thank you so much. Understood. Likewise. Well, thank you so much, Ian Murray. Really appreciate today. What a wonderful kickoff for that. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Stein and Dr. Lionel Corbett as well for your participation today. We're looking forward to Dr. Sarah Stein next month, the criminology perspective. Sarah will bring a very unique perspective to this discussion from her background, and very much looking forward to that. I apologize for the questions we weren't able to answer. We're never able to get to all the questions. There's some really good ones out there. I think we'll probably keep this format where we try to keep at least 20 to 30 minutes to field some questions. Never enough time, but there never is enough time. But we'll keep trying to do that for the future ones. This seems to be a good format with that. So with that, we'll sign off. Thank you again, and we'll talk more next month. Bye.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.